Siegel awardee. And actually, with this award, I'm actually doing double duty. The work that GreeningUSA has been involved with in the past year has allowed us to meet and interact with many knowledgeable and passionate individuals who aren't afraid to make, in John Lewis's terms, good trouble in service of environmental protection and sustainable development. Our next honoree is one of those folks who has been making good trouble for a long time. Lenny Siegel, who you will hear from shortly as our guest speaker, is our fifth honoree today. I tried to keep this a surprise from Lenny. I don't know how successful I was. One of Lenny's online bios tells us he entered Stanford in the fall of 1966 as an undergraduate in physics after recognition as a valedictorian at Culver City High School, Culver City, California. He subsequently was suspended from Stanford for on-campus anti-war activities, and he never returned for his degree. Lenny Siegel since has become executive director of the Center for Public Environmental Oversight, and he's held that since 1994. He is one of the American environmental movement's leading experts on both vapor intrusion pathway and military facility contamination. And he has visited and provided technical assistance to scores of community organizations across the country. Lenny's organization produces two internet news groups, the Military and Environmental Forum and the Brownfields Internet Forum, as well as facilitates TCE and PFAS, I'm not going to say all those words there, discussion lists. You will hear more about those, I'm sure, as I yield the floor. Lenny has served on several interstate technology and regulatory council work teams on environmental remediation, including vapor intrusion mitigation, and a dozen national research council committees addressing military environmental issues. In July of 2011, Siegel was awarded US EPA's Superfund Citizen of the Year Award for his work overseeing the Moffett Field MEW Superfund project, a site of one of US EPA's earliest and largest vapor intrusion investigations. Mr. Siegel has also served as mayor of Mountain View, California, and did that in 2018. So he comes here to us today with a wealth of experience. But as we here in Central New York have worked through the environmental scoping process for the New York State and the US environmental reviews, Lenny has been available to share his knowledge and expertise as an environmentalist and as mayor. And showed us what we need to do to galvanize community support on a wide range of community service and policies. We are grateful that he is with us today, and in a bit, we'll be given the floor to address you. But before you are able to hear his formal remarks, I want to say, in Lenny, GreeningUSA has made a friend from across the country. And it is with great pleasure to present this award to represent our thanks and appreciation, as well as recognition for your work, Lenny, over the past years to make safer, healthier, and more sustainable communities across the country. Come on up.
Thank you for the award. Do have to apologize. I have a cough that shows up, particularly when I talk. I had COVID a month ago, and they call it post-infection cough. I'll try to limit it. So I was an anti-war activist at Stanford University, and one of my specialties was doing research on the relationship between the university and the military-industrial complex in an area that we now call Silicon Valley. So I started researching the electronics industry for its war connections back in the 1960s. In 1972, I wrote my first article about local electronics companies, particularly semiconductor manufacturers, doing assembly in Asia, exploiting young women in these assembly factories. Then in around 1975, an attorney, Amanda Hawes, came to my organization. It was called Pacific Studies Center at the time, still is, CPO is part of it. And she was representing workers in the US who were working in wafer fabrication producing semiconductors. And they were having health issues because of the chemicals they were working with. Health issues included miscarriages and other reproductive harm. As a result, we formed a project called the Project on Health and Safety in Electronics. And we wrote and educated people about the occupational safety and health issues associated with the electronics industry. Around 1980, I said, if these chemicals are in the plant, they must be coming outside the plant. And I wrote my first article about the environmental implications of semiconductor manufacturing, just about the time that the truth leaked out, that they discovered that factories throughout Silicon Valley were leaking chemicals into the groundwater and polluting the water supply. And we formed the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition and did a lot of organizing to do something about the problem. In the early 1980s, the Fire Chiefs Association, as representing the fire chiefs of the 13 cities in Santa Clara County, started holding meetings to create a model ordinance on the storage of hazardous materials. We formed the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, bringing together environmental and labor groups to pressure for enactment of that ordinance, which became a national model. I'll be coming back to that in a little bit. What was interesting is that the ordinance applied both to the petroleum industry and the electronics industry. The petroleum industry sent lawyers and PR flacks first to try to stop the thing and then to exempt themselves. The electronics industry sent engineers. They said, okay, we know you're going to regulate us. Can we do it in a way that we can comply? And that's still the attitude of the industry today. They need to be regulated, but it's possible to work with them to devise regulations that'll actually work. Fast forward, there's very little wafer fabrication going on in Silicon Valley anymore for a variety of reasons. It's moved throughout the country and to Asia. And when the Biden administration announced the CHIPS Act, massive subsidies to companies like Micron and Intel, we formed CHIPS Communities United. I wasn't part of the original group, but I joined it. And I call it a band reunion, that those of us who are working on the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition and in the Boston area way back in the 1980s are getting back together with people from communities that are now facing the semiconductor industry for the first time. And so I'm going to be talking today about the environmental implications of semiconductor manufacturing, particularly wafer fabrication. The manufacture of chips, integrated circuits, starts with the creation of a pure ingot, cylinder of silicon. It is sliced into wafers that kind of look like, but they're bigger than compact discs. Those go through hundreds of processes in a wafer fabrication plant where microscopic, actually nanoscopic circuits are etched onto the silicon on the wafer. And this is basically, it uses ultraviolet light, but it's basically a chemical process for etching these circuits onto the wafer. Now, photos of these plants used to show women in bunny suits, hair cover, and they're called in super clean rooms where they were ventilated in a way that prevent particulate contamination. The purpose of that protection was to protect the wafer from the people, not to protect the people from the chemicals. And that's the key understanding you have to have about the industry. It's the cleanness is about the chip. The wafers are then mostly, although there's a little bit of a change now, mostly shipped to Asia, where they are sliced and diced into the chips and assembled into packages. We're seeing a little bit of what they call advanced packaging now, But basically, almost historically, almost all of the assembly, the final stages of semiconductor production have been going on in Asia, which I started writing about in 1972. There are several, start out by saying that in a sense, the review of the Micron plant here is ahead of the other, what they call greenfield semiconductor plants that are being proposed and built around the country. In the sense that there is no other environmental impact statement yet being produced for the Intel plant in Ohio, the Samsung plant in Texas, or the Taiwan semiconductor plant in Arizona. The reason for that, good news and bad news, is that the Micron plant is being built on wetlands. So while we're expecting the Department of Commerce to initiate the environmental review of the other plants, the Army Corps of Engineers, which was responsible for the management of designated wetlands, jumped the gun on the Commerce Department and initiated the process and had that hearing in March that I attended along with some of you. So, and also New York State has an environmental review law, as California does. So there was already scoping for, under SECRA, the State Environmental Quality Review Act, is that it? There was already review going on. So there are 2 environmental reviews going on for this plant and none for the other major greenfields. So the rest of the country is counting on you folks, as you have been doing, to keep showing up at the hearings. We've had the scoping hearings, but then we're going to have, once they produce the draft environmental impact statements for both processes, there'll be an opportunity to comment on whether those environmental impact statements are adequate. So it's an important process. The CHIPS Act provides an opportunity to improve the practices of the industry, in the sense that because the government for the first time is providing massive funding to the semiconductor industry, it can use that funding as a way to impose conditions on the industry. And so when CHIPS Communities United meets with the Commerce Department, we ask for them to do that. And they said, and their answer I would say is sort of, that is, they said, yeah, we're gonna require best management practices, but we really aren't sure. So we're keeping the pressure on. But so in addition to the environmental regulation, which all these plants have to comply with, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, there's also the leverage of government funding. And I'm used to this because of all the work I've done at military bases, where sometimes when the regulators aren't doing the right thing, you get your member of Congress to require the Defense Department to spend money cleaning up the site. And that's like being done with PFAS, which I'm not going to spell out because I'll call it PFAS anyhow. I'm going to focus my remarks on the chemical aspects, the chemical environmental impacts of the industry, but I want to mention a few others. First, there's the wetlands. And at the Healthy Waters Conference, there was somebody talking about rainwater collection at the Micron site. They seemed unaware of the fact that it's a wetlands, and it's not suitable for rainwater collection. You got to do as much as you can to preserve the wetlands. Water supply and energy supply are important issues, but there are people here who know a lot more about that than I do. We have much bigger water supply issues where I come from in California. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk briefly about planning and development. I was actually elected to the Mountain View City Council in 2014 because I said we had too many jobs. We had too many jobs for our housing. It's called the jobs housing imbalance. And the city of Mountain View is the home of Google and Intuit and the regional office of Microsoft. And we have thousands of people commuting into our community every day. Housing prices were going up. Low-income people were being driven out. So Silicon Valley is a place, of tech billionaires and people with jobs living in vehicles on the streets. So we have a jobs housing imbalance, inadequate housing, impact, the freeways are impacted, and relatively little had been done to provide housing for the people who needed to work in these various companies. And tech industry, they say they're going to provide a lot of jobs. I don't know the exact amount. They have all these projections that I don't believe, but I would expect at the Micron plant that at least half of the people who work there are going to be brought in from outside. Now, I'm not against immigration, even from Massachusetts or Virginia, let alone China and India, but you have to plan for that, because when you bring in a bunch of highly paid people, that gentrifies the communities and makes it harder for the people who've been there for a long time to survive in that community. So the environmental impact studies should look at those issues as well as the chemical environmental issues that I specialize in. And again, that's actually the kind of thing that I assume a lot of the people in the area around the plant feel. Real estate prices are probably going up already because of the plant. So the chemical impacts of production can be divided basically into water and air. There are other things, but those are the two main things. So yesterday at the Healthy Water Conference, we talked about water. And the major thing is this industry uses hundreds of different chemicals. We don't know what they use because they don't tell us. We have an idea about some of them. They use a large number of PFAS, most of which are unstudied and unregulated. And so they create wastewater that's highly contaminated. They're required to pre-treat their industrial wastes to protect the publicly owned treatment works, the sewage plant, because the acids that they would release into the wastewater would inhibit or destroy the organisms that treat the sewage. And that's fairly standard, and the industry does a fairly good job of that. They don't, in most cases, treat for PFAS, which are these so-called forever chemicals that most of us have in our blood by now. And they're, it's even found in Lake Ontario. The releases have been so significant. There's no requirement right now to treat wastewater from the plants for PFAS. It needs to be done at the point of use. That is, before it's mixed with other chemicals, before it's mixed with large amounts of water, it becomes almost impossible to treat at that point. Industry sort of agrees about that. One of the presenters from industry yesterday talked about end of pipe zero liquid release. And they said every major semiconductor company has at least one plant where they don't release all these chemicals into the environment. They reuse the water in one way or another. Well, the thing is, Intel has, I don't know, at least a dozen wafer fab plants. And if they've got at least one, that's not enough. That, as we found with the hazardous materials storage ordinance in Silicon Valley back in the 1980s, the companies will do the right thing if they're told to do the right thing. And so we can't let down their guard just because there are people who have these great PowerPoint presentations about these model plants that they've created. It's important to keep on, not only with the regulation, but to make sure that the funding from the federal government and the state government is not used to create plants that are designed to pollute. So wastewater treatment is, according to the CHIPS office at the Department of Commerce, is the #1 source of PFAS in the environment from the semiconductor industry. Now, I focus on wastewater and the stuff that goes legally into pipes. Historically, pipes leak. So you have to make sure that the same wastewater is not leaking into the groundwater, because that groundwater may be the source of somebody's drinking water supply, or may otherwise make it into the environment. So the focus is on wastewater, but whatever we learn about wastewater, we can apply to trying to prevent leaks of water, contaminated water, directly into the aquifers. Then there's air, and air I divide into three areas. First, there are what are called extremely hazardous substances. So the industry, in order to etch these circuits, uses lethal chemicals such as arsine, form of arsenic, phosphine, diborane, there's some ammonia compounds. And these, if people are exposed to them, can kill. They're very dangerous. They are regulated. Companies are required to report their quantities that they have on site. They're required to have risk management plans, but the federal law for that has thresholds of reporting that are an order of magnitude weaker than California's. And we worked on this back in the 1980s. So I think California, if somebody has 500 pounds of arsine, they have to have a risk management plan. You have to have a lot more in other states. And that's something to push on to make sure that you have the same kind of protection that we have. Of course, we actually, one of the remaining wafer fabrication plants in Silicon Valley is a research and development plant owned by Apple Computer. And they had, in 2021, I think they had 2 phosphine leaks and the buildings were evacuated. These chemicals, extremely hazardous substances, are an issue for the neighbors, for the fire department, but also particularly for the workers, who people are in the plant. So they were evacuated. I don't know that much about the occupational safety and health issues that we're going to see in the new plants because they're going to be much more automated. The wafers will be moved around by robots or on automated systems, and there'll be less worker contact with the actual processes. The workers will instead be involved at doing maintenance and supplying the materials. And I don't know as much about what that'll be. What we do know is that the exposure standards for occupational safety and health are orders of magnitude too weak compared to what other government agencies do. And this is Amanda Hawes, the attorney that brought this to our attention in the 1970s. This is what she talks about every time we have a meeting with people in the government. So the industry says they comply with standards of, actually, it's in one of the documents from the Commerce Department office that they use standards established by the Semiconductor Equipment and Materials Institute, which is an industry consortium. Of course, you need several $100s to get each one of those standards. It's not publicly available, it's not publicly developed. And that in turn relies on the weak standards that were established by the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So worker health and safety is an issue, and it's particularly an issue because the industry, with maybe one exception, is not unionized. So workers do not have the sense of job security that they need to be able to read about environmental or occupational exposures. So that's a key issue. The CHIPS Community United includes unions that hope to organize the industry. It's going to be an uphill fight. This industry has always relied on union busting. When we tried to organize, my friends tried organizing back in the 80s and 90s. So that's the extremely hazardous air emissions. The second one would be the the standard air emissions, hydrogen fluoride, hydrogen chloride, acid gases that are supposed to be scrubbed before removed from the emission of gases from the plant. And they're regulated under the Clean Air Act. These companies have very detailed permits, but Intel was socked with 2 penalties recently in Oregon for not adequately removing those acid gases from the plant. And also a lot of the other chemicals are ozone precursors, smog producing. That's your standard air pollution regulation that you see for a lot of industries. It's important, but it's not unique. And then you have something that I know Don Hughes is looking at with me, and it's the fluorinated gases. So the companies emit large quantities of fluorinated gases, which are very much stronger greenhouse gases, and much more longer lasting greenhouse gases than carbon dioxide. And the government's aware of this, the industry is aware of this. Right, I think the standard practice now is incineration. The problem with incineration is it creates products of incomplete combustion, if they scrub the emissions from that, they're creating toxic compounds that go into the wastewater. So you got to treat the wastewater. There's a recent paper that says they're using I suppose nitrogen fluoride, is that NF3?
Trifluoride.
Nitrogen trifluoride as a substitute. And according to this paper, even though it's not that much cleaner a compound, they have to use less of it. So the industry is working on some pollution prevention. But the overall message from industry is that the use of all of these very toxic compounds is essential to production. They're trying to replace some of them. There's a Taiwanese company, the work that I do on cleanup is on trichloroethylene, which was a solvent the industry used to use at the beginning to clean the wafers as part of the process. So we've got, a huge plume of trichloroethylene still under Mountain View and a lot of other similar plumes in Silicon Valley. And they've substituted with other chemicals, which also turn out to be toxic. So the primary solvent used in industry now is called NMP. I think it's N-methyl pyridine or pyrite. I don't NMP. And apparently there's a Taiwanese firm that is trying to come up with a substitute for that. The problem in general with the industry is first, they introduce chemicals before anybody has tested them, let alone proven that they're safe. They're not transparent in what they use, both in the variety of chemicals and the quantities. And they don't like being told what to do. And of course, what we have to do is make sure they're transparent and tell them what to do. And that's the purpose of the organizing. That's the purpose of getting involved with the environmental impact statements. And then one of the things the environmental impact statement should be doing is identifying all the permits these companies are going to be required to get. Because each of these waste streams requires its own permit under a separate law. I think in New York, it's primarily going to be the state DEC that issues the permits, but it's not like once the environmental impact statement is done, we're done looking at them. We need to be involved in making sure that permits deal with the issues that we're concerned about. It's a lot. You go to these conferences and somebody makes a presentation and you understand half of what they're talking about. But we know but we know basically what the issues are. This industry uses a wide variety of chemicals, some of which are extremely toxic, some of which are routinely toxic. And unless somebody looks over their shoulder and makes sure they do the right thing, it's going to poison our land, our water, and our air. So I welcome questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Lane, for that very informative presentation. So now it's your turn to engage here. And please, when you get recognized, if you could identify yourself and your organization. I'm not sure that we have time, but maybe before we do that, though, maybe could each member of the coalition that we form that's here, the organizations that are represented by the coalition here today, just so Lenny can see. So there's several of us here. I thought I saw Hillary come. Oh, there she is over there in the corner. Come in and representing the Onondaga Nation. Frank Moses from the Skinny Atlas Lake Association. Don Hughes from Sierra Club Conservation Committee. Tim Judson from Dick Hornblue from CNY Solidarity Coalition. And I think I've got all of you so far. So yeah, Lenny, you want to just call on people and engage?
Have you got a second mic for the question?
We don't, but the room is, so these.
I will repeat the questions if they're short.
our microphone, so speak loud and the room should be able to pick you up.
I'm just concerned about online, so.
Well, for that as well.
We'll let you know.
Lenny, you've been, tracking this industry for a very long time and sort of understand how they operate and what matters to the companies that make microchips. Why do you think that they picked us?
The question is, why do you think Micron picked New York? Well, the governor would probably say it was the subsidies, might be the water supply. It may be the fact that you've got a number of really strong academic institutions in this area. They do import people, but they also, at this Healthy Waters Conference, we have presentations by graduate students, poster presentations. So almost all the speaking was old white men, and all the graduate students were immigrants of color. And the universities attract technical people from all over the world, many of which stay to work in industry. And they're doing some really exciting work that I didn't understand at all.
Are there studies on the sites in Asia, what the effect of the plants were there?
Are there studies on the plants in Asia? Interestingly enough, we're starting to see some really good studies out of South Korea and Taiwan. A little bit surprising. Of course, they have lower relative labor rates, so they have an comparative advantage in producing there. I don't know as much about studies from China. China is making a big effort to compete in the semiconductor industry, but apparently most of what they do is what we call legacy chips, which means they aren't using the 2 and 3 nanometer features that the Micron plant and the Intel plant are doing, or Taiwan Semiconductor is doing. But I know less about China, but there are some good environmental studies there, to my surprise. Back there.
What has happened to the Silicon Valley plants? Have they been torn down, repurposed? No CHIPS Act plants were sought in California?
Right. So in Mountain View, we have what's called the MEW study area. It was the first area of successful commercial semiconductor production, although there was one in Texas as well. And they've left behind a plume of TCE 1.5 miles long and a 1/2 mile wide. The most common buildings above that now are owned by Google. But we're trying to build housing there, and that's one of the reasons I've been working so hard to get the sites cleaned up. It is possible to safely build housing, but you got to do extra things to make sure that people who live in the housing are safe from that contamination. This is what my introduction, vapor intrusion. You have TCE beneath the building. This was the issue in Endicott with IBM. If you have TCE beneath the building, it is basically pulled up by the relative air pressure and contaminates the indoor air. You can prevent that like you can't prevent radon pollution, but you got to make sure it's done right. So yeah, the plants are long gone. Silicon Valley's gone through many generations of industry, and now the companies pollute in different ways. Don.
Lenny, can you describe the California Act that impose stricter limits or oversight of the chemicals? Is that a statewide thing? Is this something that New York State could use as a model?
So the extremely hazardous, boy, I don't know the name of the act. The website is like extremely hazardous substances. And it is a statewide law at this point. And I believe the federal law is NESHAP, NESHAP. But the California site, which I cite in some of my documents, actually gives you the California and the federal numbers, so you don't even have to find the federal law. I don't know that New York has anything comparable. So I just
I don't think so.
Yeah, and so that's something. It's when people look at numbers like micrograms per cubic meter or pounds of arsine. We don't really know what that means. But what you can say is, oh, those people over there are getting more protection than we are. And that is something that people will understand. So I should mention that my website, the Center for Public Environmental Oversight, www.cpeo.org, CPEO, had on our main page there is that tab that says chips. And you click on that and you'll see my writings from 1972 through yesterday on this issue. And a number of the documents that I've written are on the Micron plant and on for instance, on the state technical guidance on wastewater. Unfortunately for PFAS, it's good that the industry stopped using PFOS and PFOA 20 years ago or so, because those are the worst of the PFAS compounds. The problem is those are what are being regulated. They're the ones that are found in the firefighting foam that you find in military bases like Stewart Air National Guard Base or Pease Air Force Base. And those are regulated, they're well studied, and the studies of treating them are pretty mature. A lot has to be done. We don't know how to eliminate them. We know how to remove them. This industry, when they stopped using those chemicals, started using PFBS, which has fewer carbons in a molecule. And that's the predominant chemical found in the PFAS chemical found in the wastewater from wafer vet right now, according to the studies done by Cornell University. It's not regulated, except, sort of in a mixture. So part of the challenge for PFAS is the industry uses chemicals that are unregulated or unidentified. And the Cornell studies say that majority of the PFAS in the wastewater is actually unidentifiable with our current methods. So this is the uphill fight. So again, federal government, state government, making progress on PFOS and PFOA, and you probably can't get PFOA in a frying pan or a raincoat these days. But there are all these other chemicals we don't know much about. The industry guy yesterday said it's that the shorter chain, the fewer carbons in the molecules means they're less toxic. Probably they're less toxic. But we don't really know for sure how much less toxic they are because they haven't been studied. Yet industry has been allowed, and US EPA is continuing to allow industry to introduce new PFAS compounds that have not been adequately studied. You had your hand up over there.
She answered it.
Okay.
I guess I don't understand process. If they say they can recycle wastewater, right? Somehow or other, does that mean they internally clean it up and then use it again? And when we first heard about Micron, we heard stories that Micron was going to use as much water every day as, quote, the entire city of Syracuse. So it seems to me it's like one, physics says two things can't occupy the same place at the same time. So I'm assuming one molecule of water in means one molecule of water out, right? So does that mean that they will be pushing out the same amount of water that they're taking in every day, or what? See, I don't understand the process where they recycle it. That reduce the amount of water that they're actually using, and what does that mean that the
People online hear the question? So Dick is asking.
Yes, we heard.
Okay, great. I was pointing the mic out. So we heard a presentation from a consultant yesterday who said they can do that. But I'm betting that, basically reuse almost all their water one way or another. But that's just the end of pipe zero liquid release. But it's cost, he didn't talk about why they don't use it everywhere. I assume it's costly and difficult. And so again, it's technically possible to reuse the water. There's a lot of the water goes into cooling towers and it's evaporated, but that's still a fraction of what they use. I'm waiting to get the PowerPoint from yesterday to fully absorb what he said. I mean, they can take tap water and make it ultra pure to manufacture semiconductors. They should be able to take wastewater and make it ultra pure so it can be used as drinking water or even for manufacturing. However, advanced treatment of water creates brine. And the speaker on this who talked about it, and this is a great research project for somebody to figure out how you can use the brine as a source of, say, sodium hydroxide or whatever salts are created by it, because the disposal of brine from wastewater treatment, from desalinization, is a huge environmental challenge. Just because you remove stuff from water doesn't mean it disappears. So it's still something. Some of this stuff has to go somewhere. Woman back there.
So I asked about this yesterday, but I didn't get a good answer. So are they planning on using reverse osmosis in the front end? And before they use it internally within the plant, because there's an effluent from that, first of all, and then if they do RO at the end, there's more effluent like you're speaking of. So do you know the other plants do they go through the RO process first?
So the question was, do they use reverse osmosis for the influent and for the effluent? That is one of the filtration methods that they use. It's can be effective, but it does generate wastes. We don't, nobody knows yet what exactly Micron's going to use. Carbon filtration is still widely used. There's a term called foam fractionation, which is supposedly a new way of removing PFAS. I don't know what it is. I've heard the term. There's a lot of work being done to develop these things, but to my knowledge, there is no method that can destroy PFAS at scale cost effectively. There are a number of candidate technologies. I like some of them. They're going to use energy. They're going to cost money, but none of them are in widespread use yet. The Defense Department is supporting R&D on them, and I think we'll get there. But again, the carbon fluorine bond, which makes up PFAS, they tell me is the strongest bond in organic chemistry. Now, I never took organic chemistry. 60 years ago, I took a chemistry class at 7 in the morning. So I really don't understand this stuff. But if it's a strong bond, it has to take energy to break the bond. That's, if anybody, well, Don left the room, so he can't correct me.
So my other question was about the regulatory environment though, because like Don asked about those air quality regs in California are so much stronger than here. And California also has a board, the air quality board, I don't think we've got anything like that here. I don't know if anyone knows. It's too bad the senator left. But I was wondering, have you looked at what are the regulations? Because I know California also has much stricter building code regulations, for example, because of earthquakes. But have you gone through and listed, or is anybody going through and listed, what are those different, you've got air quality, there might be wastewater, there's certainly building construction standards that are much stronger in California. But what are those other categories that exist that are stronger out there that have been applied to this industry, whereas we don't have anything like that in New York State yet. So we are on the cutting edge of regulation. And I would venture to guess that, part of the reason Micron's coming here is certainly because of the abundant water. But, the fact of the matter is all those nuclear plants are also disposing into Lake Ontario as well.
Do folks online hear the question?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, the mics are good.
Okay.
Thanks.
Awesome.
So I would say that New York, of the places that are getting CHIPS Act money, New York and Oregon are relatively good. Arizona, Texas are very weak. So if you look at the comments on the scoping comments on the state environmental review that's how I found you guys, because Glenn Coyne wrote an article about the testimony. The state DEC comments were actually fairly strong, and different departments at DEC, some for air, some for water, asked good questions. The people from the DEC's Department of Environmental Conservation, the people who spoke yesterday on our panel, shared some of our concerns about the releases into the water. So there's some interest. I don't know to what degree you need new laws, because basically the states carry out federal laws. Some of those federal laws are fairly good. It's really where you get to this discretion of the regulators. The concern that I have is looking at some of the things US EPA is doing, where they're touting all the work they're doing on wastewater, they're touting all the work that they're doing on PFAS, and they're exempting electronics. And I think that's part of the Biden administration's political strategy of putting forward the CHIPS Act as a way of showing that they're pro-industry. And after the election, I'll talk more about that. But it's a concern. Biden walked the picket line with the auto workers. Will he help? Will he support organizing by Micron workers? That's something we have to wait and see.
But before we take your question, Bob, I just want to give a shout out to the people on Zoom, in the Zoomosphere, that if you have questions as well, put them in the chat or put it in that you'd like to get recognized, and we will try to facilitate that from here. Bob, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. I'll try and make this a quick question. If we're incentivizing these chips plants here and around the world for our current economy, what's happening at the front end in terms of the chemical suppliers to solve the problem of the tools used today? You understand what I mean? In other words, the products that we're trying to regulate through the current investment. They're looking at the front end globally regarding chemicals, and at the end about treatment or solutions, new solutions to the environmental impact. Trying to see either side of the incentivization of the current plan.
So some of the money from the CHIPS Act is designed to go to equipment and materials. Applied Materials, which is located near me, is one of the major suppliers of equipment for wafer fabrication. And the vice president visited us in October or whenever to announce that they were going to get a big subsidy, and they're building new plants. So that's being addressed. What CHIPS Communities United is asking for is that some of this money actually be dedicated to solving the environmental problems. Now, again, industry and the government are putting some money into trying to find substitutes. The Cornell study that I mentioned is supported by the semiconductor industry. They aren't totally unsustainable, but they aren't sustainable enough. You have a question?
Question. Did they do a comparative study between global boundaries and what they're doing now? Because I'm hearing the same thing I heard in Albany 12 years ago. Global boundaries had some issues, and I know that Micron are going to have those same issues. They already went through because they're near Albany, and there was some problems that came up with the DEC, and they can make stricter regulations in the federal government. And RPI we did a comparative study yet?
So Global Foundries is a company, at least I was Advanced Micro Devices or IBM initially, but it's located in Malta, near Albany. And they're actually getting CHIPS Act money. They're a much smaller project, and they're more what you call a legacy producer. They aren't using the most advanced methods. The CHIPS office did what they call a programmatic environmental assessment for modernization and expansion, which is the category that the Global Foundries fits into. And that is, instead of doing a separate environmental impact statement for each plant, they have a national study of the environmental issues. And they argue that the CHIPS money can be used to modernize and improve the environmental practices of these existing plants. And they're right, it can be. And we said, and when we met with them, said, you said that it can be, can you make sure that they use the best practices? So it's going to take pressure and knowledge to be able to get these existing companies to improve their practices, because many of their practices are antiquated and don't take into account the latest environmental information we have. At last year's Healthy Waters Conference, there was someone from Global Foundries talking about how they pre-treat wastewater. So it's not like they're total, you know, they've been under regulatory pressure for some time, so they aren't totally bad. But what did they say? Trust but verify.
Issues.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Lenny, one of the things that Don reported to me from the meeting yesterday, the Healthy Waters meeting, was that one of the industry people said that, you know, that they're working towards, you know, phasing out their use of perfluorinated chemicals. You know, I guess the question is, you know, if they're building a plant, you know, in Syracuse today that's going to use those chemicals, you know, how easy is it for them to retrofit a plant to work on a different process later? Or are we going to be stuck with the process that they're building it for now?
So they say it's going to take them 10 or 15 years to actually replace most of the major PFAS chemicals they're using in production. Because and I believe them, because the production process is so complex and microscopic. So it's not like just getting a PFAS out of a toilet paper roll or a raincoat. It's much more complicated. It's going to take a long time. What I've asked for is for the wastewater treatment, that perhaps today, if they were to build a plant today, they would design filtration, whether it's reverse osmosis or carbon filtration, to remove the chemicals. And they have to deal with the stuff that's on the, you know, the waste that's generated, but design it in such a way that when the new methods are developed, that they could put those into the process. So there needs to be some flexibility in the design of the plants, just as they're going to have flexibility in the equipment that actually does the production. One of the challenges, and I attended a meeting at Micron's office in Silicon Valley. It's an office, not a production plant, late last year. And of the semiconductor, it's called SESHA, but originally it was the Semiconductor Environmental Safety and Health Association. And these are professionals who work within the industry to try to limit the occupational environmental exposures. And most of those people take their work seriously. I'm sure some are slackers, but most will take it seriously. Part of the challenge, I asserted this and they didn't disagree, is that you have engineers who design the plants and then the other people come in behind with the dustpans and try to clean up after them. And the people who are responsible for limiting the environmental occupational exposures should be involved from the start in the design of the plants. Now, these new plants, given the level of automation that we're going to see and the separation of segregation of various production processes, create an opportunity for that. But first, people like me lack the knowledge to know if they're doing the right thing, and we lack the access to information about what they're doing exactly, and we don't have the power unless we get together and build it. There's a question behind it.
So
Before you get
online.
before you get to that question in the room, from the virtual world, we have Peter who has a comment about the several questions ago about current law. And then we have Ted Smith, who would also like to make a comment. So Peter?
Yeah, I'll just say, Lenny, thank you for the depth of the work you've been doing on this topic. I was just looking up online when you referenced some of the regulations, and it appears that yes, there are quite a few regulations related to in California related to toxic and extremely toxic substances, but as you have been indicating, not all of them apply to the chip world. They apply to a lot of other things and consumer products. Ted, I think, will comment that some of those came about because of pollution, and it makes it sound like that what's needed in New York is a proactive effort with the state regulatory agencies to work with EPA to determine what we need in New York, because it's probably not exactly what has been passed in California, but but follow the lead of taking a proactive role. Is that, I presume that's a position you would endorse?
Absolutely. And I should introduce Ted Smith, who was with me at Stanford and is the founder of the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, the husband of the lawyer I talked about. And Ted might be able to answer some of the questions that I didn't answer adequately. It must be pretty early in the morning out there, Ted.
It is, but I was actually able to wake up in time to see most of your presentation, Lenny. I'm really glad that you're able to do that. I wanted to just reiterate what Peter just said. We do have a lot of regs in California, but they are as a result of having done things badly, and that people got upset, and so they put them in. I think the challenge for those of you in New York is to see if you can figure out a way to get those kind of protections in place before the harm happens. It's preventing harm, which is the real key here. And that's always the biggest challenge, because a lot of people don't react or don't do anything until they're, staring, the pollution is staring them in the face, and they said, oh my God, how'd this happen? What are we going to do about it? So as Lenny was saying too, that this is a real opportunity to do things right, or at least better from the beginning, so that you don't have the same kinds of challenges that we did here. So that's why I think both Lenny and me and Mandy and a bunch of other people are very interested in trying to support what you're doing. I think that the earlier suggestion about trying to point out what are all the regs and provisions that we have in California and elsewhere, and compare them to what's going on in the other states is a good idea. We've talked about that. We haven't done it. It's a big challenge, and we'd have to figure out, who can do such an assessment. But I think that if that's something that people there feel is important, that's something that we can take back to CHIPS Community United. I am on the steering committee there and can help advocate for that, because I do think that's a good idea.
I'm part of a group called the Interstate Technology Regulatory Council, which is a state-led consortium that involves federal agencies and industry as well, and a handful of public stakeholders. And I'm on their PFAS team, and they have a great table on state regulation of PFAS, and they have similar tables on how different states handle different environmental issues. As a result of my joining this team, they're now going to have a section on semiconductors, which they didn't have, only had a couple sentences on last time. So there are some existing interstate organizations that do comparison of state regs, but you still have to work to make it useful. We had a question back here.
If those could be sent to us, Lenny, that would be great. How we can access that, if you could let John or Don know about that, that would be a big help.
Okay, and when I write my comments on the environmental scoping or on the technical guidance, I always include links to the documents that are my resources. So if I were just writing for the government, I wouldn't have to tell them how to look up California's environmental law. But since I'm writing for the public as well, I always include those links. So if you take a look at my documents, a lot of the things I'm talking about are already accessible. You just have to be a little bit patient, because there's a lot of stuff out there.
Perfect. Thank you.
Do we know the main additive for these semiconductors with Micron? Is it phosphorus? Is it arsenic? Is it?
There are hundreds of them.
Is phosphorus one of the main ones?
Phosphine, yes.
Phosphate.
Phosphine.
Phosphine.
It's a gas, but it's used. It's in terms of, it's not used in large quantities.
Yeah.
It's just extremely toxic.
Yeah, it was just, it mentioned phosphorus at the exhibit at the most. It mentioned as a booster to silicon, there's a couple elements, and it mentioned phosphorus was one of them.
So I mean, that's not the one that I would focus on, but the environmental impact studies should be identifying as well as they can the major chemicals releases, potential chemical releases, but it's not as simple as quantities It's a matter of what the potential pathways are. That's why I talked about water and air.
Yeah.
That's the best way that I have to organize. You know, they use a lot of silicone.
Yeah,
But-
yeah, I'm referring to
That's not the issue.
I'm referring to the input, not the output, in terms of, you know, phosphorus as it's depleting as a mineable element, and it.
That's, I would not consider,
To the agricultural industry.
it's not like lithium in batteries. No, I wouldn't consider phosphorus a major issue. I would consider water and energy as the resources that are most at risk by the use of the industry. John?
Yeah, I was gonna, just to switch the focus a little bit here. You mentioned that in California, you had, I think, more employees than you had housing. And what kind of challenges did that present? And do you have any advice for us in terms of dealing with those types of issues?
So I'm sure you're familiar with the term NIMBY, not in my backyard. And the argument has been that the wealthier industrial suburbs of Silicon Valley have prevented housing development because people want to protect their quality of life, not be too urbanized. And that's true to some degree. So my campaign in 2014, and I put together a coalition of people that basically took over our city council. And we worked with Google on this, which was strange, is I would ask people, where will your kids live? That I would knock on a door while campaigning for city council, and I'd look at the precinct list, and there are 4 people in the house, 2 in their 60s and 2 in their 20s. And I say, I have 2 adult children living with me, and let me tell you, that's not the solution to the jobs, housing imbalance. And I didn't have to go any further. I don't know what your experience is. And or somebody would say, yeah, my daughter found a house in Modesto, which is in the Central Valley. So what we were successful in Mountain View, and Mountain View is building housing, and Mountain View is building affordable housing, is showing how that our quality of life will improve by urbanization, not by tearing down existing neighborhoods. We've had to fight against them tearing down old apartment buildings, but by building housing in mixed-use neighborhoods. This is where Google worked with us, building houses in mixed-use neighborhoods with medium-density housing, schools, parks, and commercial, informally commercial areas. So Google is planning to tear down their office buildings and build this kind of a mixed-use community. And that seems like it's the future for areas that are going to have increases in jobs. We're building a lot. We have a long way to go. But we, at least in Mountain View and some of the other cities, we've built support for that kind of approach. You can also say, where will your teachers live? Where will the people who mow your lawns live? There are a lot of similar things, but it turns out that you can win, you won't win over everybody. Some people don't want any change at all. And maybe some places shouldn't have any change at all. But if you're going to have a huge influx of highly paid people, you have to plan ahead. I can take one more question.
If you look at the housing situation, another factor that needs to be considered is that 1 in 3 housing purchases these days are cash purchases, most of them by investors, many of them out of state. And their concern is maybe money. So the rental prices are going up, the housing costs are going up. And there's a strong interest in limiting or stopping the investor purchase of real estate. Just to keep that.
People hear the question about investor purchase of real estate. So
Yep.
we've heard reports of that where I live, but one of my colleagues I work with on the city council is an investment advisor at Morgan Stanley, and he explained something that I hadn't realized. A lot of the cash purchases come from the fact that the tech industry pays people in stock options. And people, especially in new companies, they're paid in stock, which they can't sell but it's worth the value. And what they do is they borrow against that stock. And then instead of getting a mortgage, they seem like they're paying cash. They show up with cash that they borrowed from their stock. So this method of remuneration in the industry contributes to cash purchases by people who are working in tech that are not available to other people who have to rely on the tried and true mortgage. Now, the other thing,
So considered BlackRock.
yeah, I understand that's happening as well, the corporate purchase of single family homes. The one suggestion I made to Google, they didn't take me up on, is that they should invent a time machine so people could buy a house at the time I did, which was 1979. And that was my particular solution. Of course, you have to be my age to have done that. But looks like we're about at the end of our time. Any last?
Anybody else?
Let me just say, it's so great to see people getting together, looking at these issues
With a 50.
long before key decisions are made at this plant. This area, maybe unfortunately, is in the lead of community activism on these big new greenfield plants. There are people meeting in Ohio as well at the Intel plant. But remember, I can never remember the exact quote from Margaret Mead, but it basically it's rooms full of people like this are the only way that progress is made.